Okay, welcome to No Holds Barred Witchcraft. Today we're talking about magical tools. So, Chris, does size matter? What are your thoughts? Yes, I went there.
Depends what we're talking about.
Well,
Swords, I guess. We'll
how
start
big's
with
your
swords.
how big's your sword?
I don't actually own any swords, believe it or not. You're the
Oh,
expert on swords.
well, I've got one sword. It's quite big and blue.
Are we still talking about your katana?
Yeah, we're talking about my katana. I do like a katana. I do get told off. Ceremonial magicians don't much like the katana, and the Wiccans hate it even more because they always go on about the double-edged sword and symbolically representing the fact that it can cut both ways and that you can hurt other people, but then you can also be hurt yourself. So, great power comes with great responsibility. However, with the katana, it's only cuts on one side. So I get told off A for cultural misappropriation, which I
Yes,
don't much
obviously.
care about when it comes to katana use. And also told off that it doesn't have the right symbology. But if you notice, for those that have seen my katana, and I'll probably put a picture up in the No Holds Barred Witchcraft, we'll start a thread about magical swords, I think. It's
Yeah,
blue.
that might be a good one.
Yeah, it's blue. And that's because although I do take into the account, the kind of traditional double-edged sword, because I'm such a fan of me planetary magic and that, and I look at balance in that way. I look at Mars being red, Jupiter being blue, Mars being aggressive, and Jupiter being more benevolent. So I chose to wield a blue sword on the rare occasion that, these days in these modern times that you have to sword fight and such, that I thought I'll go with the blue sword. And I'm told it matches my eyes, so.
Ah,
But no, what sort of tools do you actually use then? Because I don't think we're much on using tools unless it's tools to actually make actual crafts. So traditional crafts, like obviously you have a spinning wheel and that.
I suppose to a certain extent, I don't really use tools. Yeah, beyond kind of candles and the occasional crystal. But then even with crystals, you know me, I prefer finding a rock somewhere than actually using a
Yeah.
crystal. So it's not like I even particularly um, use crystals in my own work. So we certainly don't use the traditional wands.
No.
We left those in the Harry Potter readings, I think. Um,
Yeah, we're not the type that wander around with magical staffs looking like Gandalf or pointy hats and cauldrons and stuff. I mean, another thing they like to take the mick out of me because I don't use a cauldron. I prefer clay pots because I can dispose of
yeah,
them and smash them up. But, it is one of
but then
those
to me,
things.
a clay pot would be a much more appropriate way of doing work than necessarily using a cauldron. Because how many things do we boil down these days? And to me, when I think of clay pot, I think of grinding work, and I
Yeah,
think of cooking and that sort of culinary art, and I think of healing. Whereas I
yeah,
don't think of when I think of a cauldron, I think of gruel and Oliver Twist. I don't tend to go to that's a magical object. So I can kind of get it, particularly I imagine those that like Celtic and the symbology that comes with using a cauldron, I imagine, but I don't really connect with the symbology. I don't.
Well, even Lady Poison uses a slow cooker these days, and she's a traditional witch.
Well, exactly.
But I suppose we should really define what you would class as a tool, because would some people class candles as a tool? What is it that you would use to define the tools of witchcraft? Because the iconic ones are the ones that you see people wielding in rituals and those sorts of settings and on television. So you've got your cauldron, your broomstick, your magical wand and all of that sort of thing. We don't really use any of those.
Yeah, I think a tool has got to be something that's used for multiple use.
Yeah,
So I don't think you could class herbs as tools of the trade, or candles or oils necessarily, because unless you're using them multiple times, you can't count your consumables, as we would call them, as tools, I guess. Even though they're included under the umbrella, I guess. I just I would think more in the things that are used for ritual use, I guess, is what most people would consider a tool. So your wands, your swords, your incense burners, and your cauldrons, and all that kind of
yeah.
paraphernalia.
Well, the dictionary defines it as a device or implement, especially one held in the hand, used to carry out a particular function. So, when it comes to the difference even between tools and machinery, I mean, is machinery a tool? So your spinning wheel, would you class that as a tool?
Well, I would, on the fact that it's an item that's looked after for the same repetitive use. I wouldn't necessarily. I don't use a separate spinning wheel for spinning normal cloth that I'm working on and spinning magical yarns. Um,
So, yeah. So when it comes to the tools that you do use, then, would you say that because a lot of people go into, especially in paganism and that sort of an area, and modern witchcraft, all about the consecration and stuff like that, where you'll have magical tools only used for magic. Are you like me and that you'll use your pestle and mortar or, your tools for multiple things? Or do you keep it sacred for working just magical practices?
it depends. So, with my pestle mortar, I would go with separate ones for separate things, mainly because one of them you're going to use for culinary use, and I suppose the only reason I say that is just in case you happen to. Most of the things obviously we will always use something that is consumable anyway. But
Yeah,
obviously, if you happen to put something like frankincense in there, you're not going to accidentally want to be eating resin. So it would more be that use. So utility use rather than because it's magical use. I would focus on that. And the same with, like, I've got a separate slow cooker that I use for dyeing yarns. Um, Again, it's just because of the chemicals that I use. It just means I don't have to be as careful cleaning it.
yeah.
Whereas my spinning wheel, I use for both. So the only difference would be I probably would smudge it between if I've done something particularly bad before before then using it to knit somebody's socks.
Mm.
Um,
Well, I suppose the difference with us is the fact that because we do a lot of production line stuff, we could constantly see clients. Professional witchcraft is essentially partly a production line in the fact that we have a store that we're constantly churning out magical oils and various things. So for us, it makes sense that you would have equipment specialized for certain practices. And even though we do have, I think it's fair to say, equipment that's specialized for certain things, I personally don't tend to treat it as sacred. The
no.
closest thing to a sacred tool that we would use is essentially either my magical sword, which I only use when teaching ceremonial magic or some forms of ceremonial magic, which I don't do that much of nowadays. Or you could think of our skull, the human skull we use. Would you class that as a
Yeah.
tool? Because I think most people probably would, but some people that might make feel uncomfortable to
Yeah.
think that
Well, I think
someone's
for us,
skulls. Yeah,
I think we call her a colleague,
yeah,
so that's slightly different for us, I guess, um, because we're not just working with the tool of, yeah. She's not. Yeah, I think it would upset her if we were to call her a tool, um, and I don't mean just by modern context,
yeah,
but yeah, I would say that in those such a situations, human remains or animal remains for that basis, I think you'd be disrespectful to almost call them tools. But then how would our what pseudonym did you call him last time?
What, Quinius
Quinius.
Porcupinus?
So would Quinius call them tools? How would he approach them? Obviously, that's different because it's necromantic work, but surely there's a relationship
Oh, I
built the
don't
same way
know.
that we
Who
work.
knows what that person gets up to? I'll have to ask him. I'll ask him at some point. Um, who knows? He might even comment on the thread on the No Holds Barred Witchcraft Facebook group, but who knows? Um, I don't know. I mean, nowadays, all I see when I see newer people that are getting into the craft and the modern approaches to craft and the books and that, it always goes on about, and particularly you see this a lot in Wicca. Oh, well, we have this very pure um, a knife, dagger, tool, whatever, and it can only be used for ritualistic and ceremonial purposes, and it needs this massive consecration and stuff like that. Well, how do you think that really varies, that approach to the approach back in the day? Because when I think of a sword, I would think, well, if it's a sword, you would definitely be wielding that in battle to defend your tribe.
Yeah.
Okay, you'll be using it for magical, things, but these sorts of things, swords and that, they don't grow on trees. It takes a lot of effort, especially
No.
back then, to
Yeah.
craft them. And although perhaps the chieftain or people that are higher up, as you say, in certain societies might have more intricate and fancier swords and stuff, and then eventually, as things go on, then there are a lot of swords, even in modern day, look at Britain and that are just used for ceremonial purposes, like knighting. If you're getting a knighthood by the Queen, for example, she probably hasn't ever shed blood with that sword.
No, but she'd specifically call that a ceremonial sword,
Yeah,
and therefore it wouldn't be sharp. It wouldn't be actually designed for combat. So you've got a very different type of tool there. You've got someone that actually probably does have a real sword that was there to kill people, and then you've got the ceremonial one that is there for to make sure you don't accidentally cut the person's head off when you're making them a knight. Like, I can kind of see the point of having both swords there.
Oh, see, this is where we differ because I hate a blunt instrument. I hate a blunt sword. When I see these people running around with these blunt swords and things like that, it makes me cringe. And I think it says a lot about a person's practice that their sword's blunt, and often so is their magic.
Yes, I suppose. But then we are talking, in the example I just used, we are talking about something that is ceremonial and part of the pageantry, rather than you're not asking those MBEs to actually fight a war for you if somebody offended you. So I think actually that's a suitable time to use a blunt instrument because
Well,
it's a
it's not a
different kind
magical
of
working, I
practice.
suppose, is it? It's not a magical working. But what about if you were to use a sword or a knife or something like that for magical purposes? Would you have said that?
Well, that to me would have to be sharp. It would have to be
Yeah.
an actual. So because otherwise, how true is the oath? That what's that scene from Craft? Um,
Are you quoting Kraft as in the film?
yeah,
Oh, these
you know
nineties
the
Wiccans will love you.
yeah that perfect love and perfect trust thing. It was what was it? It's better to rush upon this blade
Yeah.
than enter this circle with fear in your heart. That's what it was. Um, and in that situation, if you're asking somebody to take an oath like that, then that should have actual consequence. So that athame that she was using, in theory, for me, should be sharp. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, it just makes me cringe a little bit because what I see too much of is people seeing something in a film or reading something in a book. And, very often it is those books that came out in the between the 1950s and now about witchcraft and magical tools and stuff. And it's very much a case of These people that run around in these circles and consecrating things and doing rituals that are wielding a sword, if you put an actual sword in their hand, they wouldn't know how to use it. And a sword or any tool essentially is an extension of yourself. So for me, I don't know if I'd say that it's an empty ritual, but it makes me feel like the practitioner is quite blunt, and their magic is therefore blunt. Because if it's a tool, you should really be able to use it. Because watching
Yeah,
a proper craftsperson, no matter what craft it is, whether it's a magical craft or, you know, take textiles or, masonry or something like that. If it's a craft, then the tools in a real master's hands make great work. And what I
yes,
see is it feels like cheap imitation. And as well as I do think that, to a certain extent, it's a case of witchcraft from a mundane person's perspective often gets viewed as if it belongs to a different time, which partly it does. I mean, the fact that we don't necessarily all go around using candles and stuff nowadays, candles, sorry, cauldrons, because cooking implements back then, everyone was using cauldrons, but nowadays
yeah.
we
It was
have
to
better
hand.
resources. We have slow cookers and pressure cookers and stuff like that. So,
Yeah,
a lot of that comes down to the visual aspect of it. What am I saying? Oh,
the
it's one of those
aesthetic.
words. The aesthetic, that's it. Thank you very much. Yeah, a lot of it will come down to the aesthetic. And I mean, how many people do you think come towards witchcraft because they like the magic
The way it
versus
looked.
come towards it because they like the aesthetic of it?
Well, I think that's a dangerous conversation for another time. But you know,
So you're
um,
trying to get out of this one then?
I'm not trying to get out of it.
Yeah,
I'm
yes, he's
just
trying to
saying that
get out of it,
obviously.
everyone. You can see.
No, no, I'm not trying to get out of it. It's one of those where we've democratized to a certain extent the availability of tools in the modern world. So if I want a specialist knife for filleting fish, I can order one on Amazon. If I'm willing to pay for it, I'll get a better standard of one, and it rocks up. In an ancient period, either you had that tool because you knew how to use it, or you wouldn't have spent the resource in order to get such a tool. Whereas now, you can go on eBay or Amazon and get every kind of athame you possibly want, or you can get every type of pestle and mortar that you could possibly ever want, made out of the strangest of things from the other side of the world, and it comes next day delivery from China.
And how many of those people that actually buy those tools and implements and that actually use them versus putting them on a shelf to look pretty?
Well, exactly, but some of them would say that they've got the tools that they need if they were to use them.
You
But to
mean
me,
they buy it
that's
just
just
on the off chance they might one day actually do some magic?
not exactly what I said, but I kind of meant that. But the what I was trying to say was more the fact that they're told that that should appear on their altar. It is
Yeah.
part of the practice, and therefore they must have it. Like, which is where it harks back to the kind of um, Catholic, where all those items are there on show for other people to see,
Yeah.
that must be there. Whereas actually, I have no use for having a chalice. So I have never purchased a chalice. I might have you know, a pretty candle that comes in a glass that I then go, oh, actually, when that's finished burning, that would make a nice use for that, if that makes sense.
Recycling.
Where I've recycled the glass and gone, oh, actually, bearing in mind I've already burnt a candle in it, it's now been cleaned up and I can reuse it. If that hadn't have come into my life, I wouldn't have gone and bought a chalice. you get what I mean?
Well, I think most of our stuff, that's again, our craft's very practical, so we use practical things. But okay, so if you were to create a magical tool for yourself, why would you want to do that? So what would make you go out of your way to craft a magical tool?
Well, me personally, probably a client asking for something is
What,
is about the
asking you to make one for
yeah
them?
would about probably be about the only time I would probably use something like that. There was stuff I've made when I was still learning, when I was in my teens, and I've kind of made it, never used it ceremonially at all, but was intrigued as to, oh, those would look nice if I put those two things together, and added those feathers to that twig I found and that little bit of offcut of crystal. I've never used it magically, but actually the process of putting those things together was the learning process. So beyond actually I didn't use it for anything, but at the moment it was what would you call it? Exercise for combining units. At which point I was kind of like, I'd probably never do that again. But in that moment, I had combined those items because they were found, or because that in that moment of thought process, those things came to me, and then combined them into a piece.
Okay, so what about, would you class a talisman or say an amulet, such as the necklace that you often wear, because you've used that for a purpose? Would you class that as a tool?
Oh, that's an interesting one.
Because you
I
technically
suppose.
repurposed it, didn't you? You didn't craft it yourself from scratch.
No,
But how many people forge
no.
their own swords nowadays?
Well, exactly. So with that one, it was interesting because obviously I'd bought it for an unknown purpose, and then it found its own purpose. But that sort of thing is probably closer to what most people would wear robes for, because
Yeah.
I wouldn't go into making something as elaborate as a robe, because I would do that sort of work energetically
Yeah.
rather than having to create a tool. With that, it's just a trigger and on switch. So the tool itself isn't a tool, it's just the on switch to something I do energetically speak.
Well, would you say, like I tend to say, or would you agree with me when I say that a tool is essentially like stabilizers on a bike? It's designed to make your life a little bit easier. So the more beginners often use more tools, and then the idea really is to strip those tools away and get rid of them
As
to
they
the
get
point we
better.
don't need to anymore. Is that fair to say?
Yeah,
And
I think that's fair to say.
one tool I know that you absolutely love, of course, is tarot.
Oh, don't.
Because
Yeah,
tarot's a tool that people never want to give up.
no. But again, like you say, I think that would go straight to the stabilizers motif that you use there, because it's one of those where they're used to seeing, and it's a comfortable arrangement. But surely at the point that you understand what the cards are and that they're just an extension, at which point surely you think, well, to grow, surely I must move beyond them. Whereas some of these, they like the comfort, I think, of having them there. They're
Yeah,
a nice something to fall back on. Um,
like a child's
and
comfort
also,
blanket or nightlight, you mean?
yeah, but to be able to be a little bit more fair about tarot readers, I guess, is a case of that works both ways. I know a lot of very skilled psychics that still use cards, but they use cards for the client. It
Yeah,
makes the client feel comfortable,
yeah.
and not necessarily because they're reading the cards. They've got the cards out for show because that's what a client expects to see. And I wonder if there's a certain amount of that probably is in the sorts of products we design when we set up our shop, and how it physically looks on a stall. we had that in mind too, surely, when we were designing how the setup looks, because obviously to a certain extent we wanted it to represent us well, but equally had to set the bar as to what people realise what we do. Because we definitely did that with the website when we first started, making sure it was kitted out with the things we expected people to want.
Well, I mean, yeah, a lot. That's the thing, isn't it? I mean, when you have the sort of business we have to cater to other people's practice. Whereas if you are literally in the professional witches slash cunning folk, whatever, where you're just servicing clients, which sounds dirtier than it actually is, when you're just basically doing the magic for the clients, then you can have
Yeah.
your own ways of practicing, I suppose. But we have to cater to multiple disciplines. Um, so what about, okay, so being a classicist, what about tools from the ancient world for magical purposes? Do you think that there was, is it fair to say that there's a lot more of a case of, the rituals not so much empty like you see with a lot of modern practice, where everything in a ritual then or in a magical working is there for a reason? Or does it just too varied, do you think?
Um, it can be. I think I automatically would go to kind of Greco-Roman with that, which I'm assuming is where you want it to go.
I
Um,
presume so, but you never know. You could throw in a bit of Egyptian.
in those you talk, in those you're talking about ritual performance. So because you're talking about ritual performance,
Yeah.
there would be outfits and there would be specific headdresses, or they might include a lyre, or to depict various gods and goddesses, that sort of thing. But the items would be working. They would be workable objects. So you wouldn't have something that looks like a lyre. You would have a lyre that was specially made, and on top of that would probably be so elaborately decorated that it was both beautiful and workable. Um, and those parts wouldn't belong to that practitioner. They would belong to the mystery school. So it would be a case of those items have been used for rituals every year for as long as that cult had existed, and therefore they would only replace it at the point that it was broken,
Hmm.
or they'd probably repair it and repair it and repair it. Um, or that's where you get depositions in sanctuaries, is kind of when the items stop being fully working, so they dedicate them to the goddess, and somebody would pay for a very nice new one. But yeah, in those situations that is part of the performance, and so maybe to a certain extent, maybe some of these kind of pagan rituals are exactly that. They are a performance and written in such a way. Um, Whether or not you class that as witchcraft is a slightly different thing. So, because surely if the bits of Greco-Roman that you would consider witchcraft would probably more likely be the devotion. So, a curse tablet, that in its moment is created for exactly that purpose, and given to the god or goddess. It's not at all in the sense that you wouldn't reuse it again. So once it's given, it's gone. So would you class that as a tool?
Well, again, a tool is an implement that you're using to get a job done, essentially, like a screwdriver or something like that, just perhaps a little bit more sacred. I mean, I know that from the witches that we meet, that are at of a certain level or above, if they do public rituals for mundane people or inexperienced ritual, they do involve a lot of drama in that because that's what people are used to seeing. That's what people kind of expect, I suppose. But at the same time, in their personal practice or in their practice as a private group or coven, you don't have all of the extra bits and pieces. Well, I can't believe we're out of time, but we'll carry on talking and do a full recording for this episode on the Patreon. Bye, everyone.